Two, one.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. And I've been called upon to do a solo episode today, and I'm going to be talking about something that was inspired by a recent episode of Ayn Rand Institute's podcast, New Ideal podcast, is it called? They spoke about a guy named Jonah Goldberg who recently spoke about Ayn Rand. And check out their recent episode for a lot of details on what Mr. Goldberg said in his recent podcast, and some very bona fide objectivist thinkers analyze what he said. But it triggered in me some memories of Goldberg, whose book I read around 2007 or 8. I was either in my late teens or about 2021. And I was a big Ayn Rand fan. I had read all of her fiction and had begun reading some of her nonfiction. And like many people with sort of a budding understanding of Rand's philosophy, I kind of presumed the conservatives or Republicans, with all of their faults, I don't always agree with their politics and they're too religious, but they're better than the left. And, I think they're probably good allies. That's what I thought at the time. Whether or not that was the right understanding, the right approach is maybe a topic for another day. But long story short, I began to read various books by various people, including Liberal Fascism, a book by Jonah Goldberg. And he is, if you don't know, a National Review guy. Like, National Review is William F. Buckley's journal, who I think you could arguably say from around the 50s or 60s up until fairly recently was sort of like the conservative publication. And they really, really didn't want Donald Trump to become the Republican. And Donald Trump became the Republican. And a lot has changed in the last several years, I think, in the conservative world, in the Republican world. It's become a lot more nativist, a lot more less intellectual, arguably. It's become, in my estimation, the movement and the party of jeering and sneering. And I'm not even going to say it's the party of Donald Trump. I'll say it's the party of Don Jr. Don Jr. Triggered. Let's own the libs. Milk Toast, Turning Point, USA, anti-intellectual, high school girl from the 90s movie type of arguments. You're irrelevant. I'm popular and you're irrelevant. That's basically what it's become. Now that I've basically alienated half of the people watching here, let me get back to Jonah Goldberg, who at this time in this story, around the late 2000s, Hillary Clinton was running for the nomination of her party, and people assumed she was going to get the nomination. People assumed after 8 years of George Bush, absolutely Bill Clinton's wife is going to, people love Clinton. His wife is a shoo-in. People thought there was maybe a faint trace of some guy named Barack Obama running. A black guy thinks he can be president? Yeah, good luck with that. People assumed Hillary Clinton was it. And on the Republican side, people were for staying in Iraq and staying longer. That was basically the Republican response to the anti-war sentiments in the culture. So Mr. Goldberg, then a prominent person, wrote this prominent book, Liberal Fascism. And if you read it, some of you younger people, if you were to read this book, I think you would be very surprised at how smart a Republican was. Considering, like I said, what they've become. They become the party of triggering the libs. Back then, you could be a highly intellectual. There was a lot of very intellectual forces, I think, on the right among conservatives. They were into talking about the founding fathers, the founding principles. You might even hear individualism spoken of a little bit. And principles were a big it's just night and day different from what I think it is today. So back then, Jonah Goldberg, he wrote this book, Liberal Fascism, and I read it. And, assuming that it's well researched, which it seemed to be when I read it, and I'm still assuming it basically is all correct, it definitely helped me understand the world I was living in when it comes to the culture, when it comes to politics, So beforehand, maybe I had this view that many people have, which is, on the right, like all the way to the right is, fascism, and all the way to the left is communism, and, somewhere in the middle is, liberty, let's say. But of course, that's a very simplistic, it's a very incorrect way to look at things. I think the correct spectrum is there's individual rights on one end, and there's kind of everything else on the other end, and that's the spectrum to assess different political forces by. What Jonah Goldberg points out in Liberal Fascism is that a lot of bad things had been done by the United States, and the America bashers are right about that. But the mistake that conservatives make, says Goldberg, is that conservatives try to downplay all of America's past atrocities because it makes America look bad. But the correct response, says Goldberg, is yes, America has committed atrocities, but those atrocities were largely committed by leftists, by so-called progressives, by fascists at a time when the word fascist was not a dirty word. So before even World War I, there was a significant group of people in America who said, all right, we've got this great experiment here. Let's see if we can engineer society. Let's see if we can, train American kids to be different from their parents. Let's see if we can socialize and engineer and perform some eugenics. And, let's see what we can do. Let's see what brave new world might come of this. And many of them thought this figure overseas, Hitler, seemed kind of cool. Some of them were friendly with him. Mussolini, absolutely. There's a lot that Goldberg goes into in his book, both talking about the American progressive fascists as well as the European ones. Sadly, the European ones would become dictatorial. In America, we did have a progressive president, Woodrow Wilson. I think it's not controversial to say he saw himself as a fascist. Again, the word fascist was not a dirty word. It was not synonymous with concentration camps and just cruelty and complete despotism or whatever. It was just fascism, I think, meant the state, along with some help from corporations, will engineer society and we'll all live as a happy family, I suppose. One of the interesting points Goldberg makes in this book is that if fascism does come to America, it's probably not going to look like 1984, the book. It's probably going to look more like Brave New World, smiling, happy, making you think this is for your own benefit. I'm from the government and I'm here to help type of fascism. And that got me to think of things in a new way. So Goldberg, he goes through this history of fascism in the United States. He talks about that the earliest kind of iteration of this movement were anti-abolitionists. Then came, like I said, the progressive fascists like Woodrow Wilson. And some of the things Goldberg documents in his book, it would shock you to see kind of what took place in America in terms of government, telling children to snitch on their parents if they're wasting food or something like that, and the stuff that was done during wartime. Of course, Woodrow Wilson infamously took America into World War I, not because it served America's interests in any way, but precisely for the opposite reason, because it would be a great moral adventure, to go to this optional war. Absolutely despicable, and the world is still paying the price. I'm including America is still paying the price for that absolutely irrational decision. But so if you think philosophy is irrelevant, it's just a question of which candidate is gonna impose which policy. I think philosophy definitely matters. But back to the book Liberal Fascism, Goldberg documents how JFK was certainly saying things and doing things that were influenced by this fascist doctrine. Him famously in America, in contemporary eyes, but maybe infamously in my eyes and yours, JFK said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," and leading Ayn Rand to call him a fascist, or to refer to his new frontier as fascist. Goldberg points this out in his book, Liberal Fascism. He says, JFK said that, leading Ayn Rand to call him fascist, or however he phrased it. Goldberg documents the hippie movement very much as being eerily similar to the brown shirts in Germany, and other fascist movements in Europe. So the hippies, these peacenik, live free, or what are they? Make love, not war, smoke weed, and hit the drum hippies. Goldberg, I think, accurately points out how eerily similar their behavior was, the hippies, to Meshuggahs in the Weimar Republic, in maybe Italy, in fascist movements. And this was probably the first time I was exposed to this idea that like fascists are driven by this urge to do something. Like we need to do something. We cannot be complacent. That's kind of like the fascist attitude. And you can see something maybe similar in pragmatism, in my understanding, also there, because you can't really reason, you can't really understand reality. So you just need to take action. And how do you know which action to take? Just kind of whatever occurs to you, emotion, I suppose, and then see if it worked or not. So you see this type of thing occurring in various factions of society, the pragmatists, the fascists, all these, irrational movements and thinkers are saying, just act. We just need to act. We cannot be complacent. We just need to do something. And this leads to a movement which leads to nothing positive. And I think conservative intellectuals, in times and places when that's not an oxymoron, they say that this comes from the Enlightenment, right? So all of this urge to move, that's the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment emboldens the individual to think he's the king, like that he can do anything his judgment or that his opinion says. But of course, I think an objectivist view of philosophy, of the history of philosophy, will point out, no, there was a good Enlightenment. Francis Bacon et al. Would, say, you need to look at reality and then make an informed decision. But the emotionalism we see came from the rejection of the Enlightenment. So anyway, Goldberg talks about how fascism was largely a creation of leftists, of progressives, and jumping forward to current day, when Goldberg is writing his book, Liberal Fascism, he had a chapter, I think, called We're All Fascists Now. How cool is that? We're all fascists now. Like, how cool of a chapter name is that? And he points out, like, everywhere you look now, movies, TV shows, music, so many things in the culture are influenced by fascist things, by fascist influences, and we don't even realize. One of the examples Goldberg points out is the movie V for Vendetta. V for Vendetta, Goldberg points out, the hero and the villains alike are fascist, right? If you've seen V for Vendetta, this iconic, anti-authoritarian movie, it's trash, first of all. So I think the creator, it is an anarchist. Someone here probably can tell me. Of course, the villains in V for Vendetta are like explicit Hitler-like authoritarians, and the good guy, is his name Guy Fawkes? Guy, whatever, the guy with the mask and all of his movement. Exactly. They are, like I said, just, we need to move. We need to do something. We need to blow up a building. We need to blow up a building. Chaos. Chaos is better than the status quo. That's the fascist attitude, I think, in a nutshell. And you certainly see that in V for Vendetta. So what the hell comes after that whole rebellion in V for Vendetta? What? Peace and prosperity? Somehow I doubt it. So Goldberg points out, V for Vendetta, the villains and the heroes are fascist alike. I mean, that's so very intellectual and often very accurate. Now, what does Goldberg offer as a solution to this dilemma? Like, what is a good course to follow, since fascism is clearly not it? It's very underwhelming and unimpressive. I think, like the fate of Goldberg himself, as we've seen in current times, his solution is dogma. Dogma, like, we pick a leftist dogma or a conservative dogma to basically follow and occasionally make exceptions to. So that's the ultimate choice Goldberg offers in his book, if I understood correctly, and I think I did. So basically pick, conservatism as the basic dogma to follow. And occasionally we can make exceptions, let's say legalizing marijuana, for instance. So he can, or I don't know, other things as well. So I saw an interview with him around that same time where somebody was interviewing, asking him, what do you think of gay marriage? And Goldberg gave a thoughtful answer. He said, it's inevitable, because there are people in America living, like same-sex couples living together in a way that largely resembles marriage. So it's inevitable that eventually we're just going to legalize it and call it marriage. And Goldberg adds, I, as a Burkean, would like to move there as slowly as possible. So change should not be too quick. I think he said Burkean. Burke was he's kind of like the conservative godfather. He wrote Reflections from the French Revolution. Am I thinking of the right guy? I tried reading that book once. A Republican friend some 10 years ago, he told me to read Reflections from the French Revolution. I told him to read Return of the Primitive by Ayn Rand, and each one of us could not understand the other's recommendation. Burke was unreadable to me. I couldn't understand a word of it that when I tried reading it, and my friend at the time said he cannot follow anything Rand is saying, and he was criticizing it from a literary standpoint. I mean, we certainly could not see eye to eye or understand one another's books. At one point in the book, Liberal Fascism, Jonah Goldberg says, but for foreign policy, libertarianism would be perfect. He says something like that. I remember seeing in his book, which I agreed with at the time. I know that's kind of a dumbing down wording of it to say, but it made sense. Libertarians, they don't really understand the Islamic threat. Someone like Ron Paul doesn't understand the Islamic threat, but if he was good on that, libertarianism would be great. That's what Goldberg said in his book, which made sense to me at the time. So I was surprised to hear him on his podcast the other day in the aforementioned clip, Goldberg saying that, it took a long time for him to kind of warm up to libertarianism, and he's basically libertarian at a federal level and a bit less libertarian on a state level, and completely not libertarian on a local level. He conflates individual rights with family, or that family value. He's very, very sloppy the way he bundles together the choices of families to live how they want and the government forcing them to do so. So his thinking gets a little bit sloppy at times, but I was very impressed with his book at the time. I was a much younger man. I don't know if that book would hold up if I were to crack it open today, but it definitely influenced me. It definitely got me to kind of take a closer look at certain things, like what is fascism? What does it mean? What is the political spectrum? What does the political spectrum even mean? And I think looking back, that book was remarkably intellectual. And this book, Republicans would talk about it. They would refer to it. If you went to something like CPAC, the conservative, political action conference, is that what that stands for? You would hear people casually. I wasn't at CPAC, but I saw videos of people having conversations at CPAC, referring casually to Goldberg's book. It's like the Goldberg book. Now, it had on the cover of Liberal Fascism a smiley face, the classic emoji, the yellow happy face with the Hitler mustache and the emo hair, whatever you call Hitler's haircut. So it's provocative. Talk about also being ahead of the curve and labeling your opponents as Nazis. This Goldberg guy was certainly ahead of his time. But yeah, in his book, he points out that fascism was largely present in America and in Europe, and largely came from establishment, non-conservatives. He also speaks favorably of libertarianism and just says, if libertarians had a better foreign policy, to him, a good foreign policy was, stay in Iraq indefinitely. That's basically the National Review. That's what Republicans said. They thought George W. Bush was a wonderful guy. So it took me a while to understand what was wrong with that. I mean, with the help of people like Elon Jorno from the ARI podcast the other day, along with Yaron Brook and Alex Epstein, they published a book called Winning the Unwinnable War, which explains why George W. Bush is wrong and what the application of objectivism to foreign policy would look like. It would be swift, direct, egoistic. In other words, not self-sacrificial, but it would protect Americans' rights and defeat enemies with quickness and with precision, which is certainly not what took place in Iraq nor in Afghanistan. I saw then Jonah Goldberg on the Piers Morgan show a couple years later when the whole Tea Party thing was raging in America. This anti-Obama Tea Party, they were called. They wanted, it was unclear exactly what they wanted. They were mostly, I think, opposed to something. They thought Obama is a socialist, and they opposed that. I think their failing always was it was never clear what they were for. They were whatever it is they were doing. They were a lot more intellectual, however, even with their faults and their lack of focus. They were light years more intellectual than Republicans today, and which is why you saw people like Ted Cruz back then and Marco Rubio and others getting elected to office, speaking the language of individual rights, speaking in the language of capitalism. So, you don't know what you have till it's gone, right? Like, as unfocused and unintellectual as the Tea Party people were, I mean, compared to what Republicans had become, you start to get nostalgic, don't you? I do, I guess. So the Tea Party was happening, and Jonah Goldberg went on Piers Morgan to promote his newer book. This was a couple years after Liberal Fascism. And Goldberg's newest book, if you can believe this, was making the point that Republicans or conservatives are more intellectual than the left. Imagine saying that. I mean, I think he made a good point. The point is, him saying that was not that controversial. Like, it didn't shock people. Today, if you tried saying, the movement of Don Jr. and owning the libs, and Ben Shapiro destroys college student with facts and logic, if you say that movement is more intellectual than the leftists, I think you'd be met with some very, very confused looks from people. But back then, Goldberg was saying, he says, and this is exactly what he said to Piers Morgan. I remember it clearly. I mean, paraphrasing very closely, he said to Piers Morgan, he said, "We conservatives, we talk about Ayn Rand and Adam Smith, and we just love talking about ideas and philosophy. And the leftists, or the liberals, all they talk about is identity," right? So now I'm really paraphrasing. I'm just going, I'm expanding on what he said. His point was, the liberals, the leftists, all they want to talk about is, I'm black, you're white. I'm a woman, you're a man. I'm gay, you're straight. I'm trans, you're cis. That wasn't so much. That last one wasn't so much spoken of at that time, but you get the point. He was saying all these liberals are talking about is identity politics, but we conservatives, we talk about Ayn Rand. We talk about, the founding principles. He literally mentioned Ayn Rand as an example of a conversation topic among conservatives that demonstrates why they are intellectual and much more thoughtful and respectable than the leftists. And I think him saying that at that time, it was a very arguable point he was making. So as sort of unfocused and ultimately unintellectual as the Tea Party and the conservative movement proved to be by their disintegration, by their dissipation, it still was a arguable point. It still was a plausible case that Goldberg was making, is that conservatives are intellectual compared to what we're seeing on the left. Now, to fast forward to today, I think the conservative movement has largely become a movement of insults, of jeering and sneering, of owning the libs and triggering the snowflakes. It's rare to see a very thoughtful point being made on the right. And what you see from the left is them saying, educate yourself, you need to study history, blah, blah, blah. I mean, everything the leftists are saying is crap, don't get me wrong, but they're making intellectual points compared to what I think we're largely seeing on the right. So whatever happened to Jonah Goldberg, where are they now is the question. Where is he now? He has largely been castigated, largely been laughed out of town by the new right, by the Republican Party of Trump, senior or junior, whatever. The new Republicans, They laughed the National Review out of town. They laughed Jonah Goldberg out of town. And yeah, talk about falling from grace. I think my observation is accurate. So here's Jonah Goldberg now. I'm sure he still has plenty of following and plenty of influence, but a fraction of what he used to have ever since Donald Trump and his ilk transformed the movement. And this never Trumper, Jonah Goldberg, he was doing his podcast, and it was pointed out to him by some friends and fans that in the American Crime Story series that's airing right now, or just was airing, whatever the case may be, young Goldberg is depicted in his office on the phone with a poster of Atlas Shrugged in his office. And by the way, I think I auditioned for that show, if you can believe it. I auditioned to play the lawyer of Paula Jones. So assuming Paula Jones, who sued Clinton, is in the same series as this Monica Lewinsky series that's airing, I could have been on that show. I auditioned not once, but twice. They call it a callback, when they like you so much that they invite you back to audition a second time. So, wow, who would have imagined that? I could have been on TV. How cool is that? A host of this show that was almost on TV. I can't think of anything cooler than a host on this network who was almost on TV. But anyway, in this show, Impeachment, the young Jonah Goldberg is depicted with an Atlas Shrugged poster in his office, and when it's brought to his attention, he spoke on his podcast about how annoyed he is by that he was never really a big fan of Ayn Rand. Interestingly, I remember him mentioning Ayn Rand either neutrally or favorably, and he specifically brought her up talking to Piers Morgan to highlight how, yeah, we conservatives, we're intellectual. Unlike the leftists, we're thoughtful. We talk about Ayn Rand and Adam Smith. Interesting, Goldberg. You were not embarrassed of Ayn Rand, 10 years ago, if I recall. What happened? What are his motivations for pushing away Ayn Rand so strongly right now? I don't think it's that he wants to now join the stupid Republicans. I don't think that's what it is. I would guess either he's jealous of Ayn Rand because Goldberg's movement has gotten so stupid and anti-intellectual that he's like jealous of how intellectual Rand always was and how philosophical her case always was that she made, that he's he's just, I know this is psychologizing, or is it psychologizing to speculate on someone's motivations? Is that I still, whenever I hear about psychologizing, people say well, not to psychologize, but it's like, oh, no, I'm not racist, but I'm about to say something racist, right? It's always not to psychologize. So anyway, I don't know if I'm psychologizing or not, but maybe he is annoyed or jealous of Ayn Rand's intellectual caliber, and it triggers something within him to be associated with her, because he was always kind of jealous, or he is currently jealous at how intellectual Ayn Rand and her case for freedom was compared to the stupidity he now needs to deal with on his own side of the aisle. Or another kind of reason he might be pushing away Ayn Rand is he takes it as an insult that he's associated with her because he himself has been cast as irrelevant, right? Like I said, Republicans have become the party of high school girls from a 90s movie. I'm popular and you're irrelevant. That's basically today's conservative movement in a nutshell. You're irrelevant. You're irrelevant. You're irrelevant. So Goldberg has been called irrelevant every day for the last 6 years or so, and now he's being associated with a novelist philosopher who the new right definitely sees as beneath irrelevant, beyond irrelevant, right? The Steve Bannon party, the Steve Bannon movement definitely sees Ayn Rand as completely irrelevant. So poor Jonah Goldberg here. First he's irrelevant, and as he's clinging to some degree of relevancy in the conservative movement, he's now being compared to Ayn Rand, who is beyond irrelevant in the eyes of conservatives, in my estimation. All right, that was my thoughts and opinions, my reflections, and my memoir on the Jonah Goldberg that I used to know. Thank you, Sammy is bored again for the 99 pence. Thank you, Marilyn, for the 99 cents. Thank you, Marilyn, again for $4. And thank you, Sammy is bored again for 99 pence and a picture of a hot dog. Interesting picture. Interesting. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I guess with that, we can call it a wrap. We want to know what you think. Coming up at 7 p.m. UK time, The Integrating Investor with Mr. Levin, Seth Levin, right? Looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us today. See you on Clubhouse. We're going to jump over there, and we want to know what you think. So thank you and goodbye.